was the moment we needed the most. You kick up the leaves and the magic is lost. Tell me your blue skies fade to gray. Tell me your passion's gone away. And I don't need no carrying on. You stand in the line just to hit a new low. You're faking a smile with the coffee to go. And tell me your life's been way offline. You fall into pieces every time. And I don't need no carrying on. Cause you had a bad day, you take it one down. You sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie. You work on a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie. You're coming back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day, you had a bad day.
Consistency has been a hard trait to come by for the Detroit Tigers this season, and they've officially waved the white flag, losing 9 of their last 10 and officially out of the playoff race. So what's been their biggest contributing factor to their tailspin, and what does that mean for the future of manager Brad Ausmus? I spent the afternoon chatting with Jesse Pantaosco of Roto-World and NBC Sports, who covers the major leagues for the network, to get his thoughts on the state of the Tigers. So after the Tigers started red hot at 11-2, and then they were 27-12 at one point, then obviously their season sort of has taken a nosedive. So can you tell me what you think is the biggest contributing factor to why the Tigers are no longer in contention?
Yeah, it's been really a lot of different things. Miguel Cabrera getting hurt right in the middle of the year when he was, red hot, hitting 360. That didn't help. And I think reality just set in after a while. They lost some big guys. Sure, Smiley, Porcello, and Verlander was hurt for a while. And, it's really tough to close out games when you don't have a real closer. The back end of the bullpen is still a real trouble area for them. And two other guys that have been good in years past, Anibal Sanchez has given up a ton of home runs this year and just doesn't look like himself at all. Definitely doesn't look like an $80 million pitcher. And Victor Martinez got hurt, and he's still hitting only about 240 after they signed him to a big extension. So those have kind of been disappointments for them. Just hasn't all meshed this year.
And in terms of Brad Ausmus, with the Tigers currently in a tailspin, and of course he won the division his first year, but since that point the Tigers have sort of been on a downward track, and he hasn't really proven that he is worthy of coming back for next season. So do you think the Tigers will let him come back next season, or do you think they'll move on from Ausmus?
I feel like it's still pretty early for that. You're probably a little more connected to it than I am, being in the area. But they were a first place team last year, and it hasn't been a great season, but it hasn't been necessarily a train wreck either. They're still only, I believe, 8.5 games out in the wild card. They're not going to get it, but and I think they've kind of shown that they're willing to maybe rebuild a little bit with trading Cespedes and David Price at the trade deadline. So I think they'll give Ausmus a little more time. But you saw they made the move getting rid of Dombrowski. I think that was kind of um, the big move and going and changing directions and going with Al Avila. So I mean, I haven't watched enough Tigers games this year to know if like on a day-to-day basis if Ausmus is really screwing up or anything. I know they've had some difficult times with obviously picking a closer has been a trouble area for them since they got rid of Soria and after the Joe Nathan injury. So I guess maybe you could blame him for that, even though they don't really have the right personnel for it. I know they've been trying Rondon and Alex Wilson and everything. And there was that weird instance where Jose Iglesias kind of flipped out in the dugout. But other than that, I don't know. I think 2 years into your managerial thing, I think next year will probably be kind of a make or break year. The Tigers for the last few years have just been able to kind of roll out of bed and win that division, and that's just not possible anymore. The other teams have gotten better. The Royals look like the best team in the American League. Um, and even the White Sox and Twins have shown some improvement this year. So it's an improved division. The combination of a lot of things. Tigers have gotten worse. They lost a lot of big pitchers and are kind of in a position where they've overspent on some guys and are kind of stuck in kind of, I guess, payroll jail a little bit with these bad contracts with Verlander and Cabrera and Anibal Sanchez. So I wouldn't put all of that on Ausmus, and I think next year will be kind of a better test for whether he's going to keep his job or not.
They did get rid of Dave Dombrowski also. Alavila's in. So I'm wondering, what do you think the biggest change for the Tigers would be from that perspective, and what direction do you think Avila will take the team? And do you think it was a mistake for the Tigers to get rid of Dombrowski?
Well, I think there are good general managers and bad general managers in Major League Baseball. And I always thought Dombrowski was one of the better general managers. He was with the Tigers for a long time, and he won a World Series in Florida too. So I think there just becomes kind of a point where you have to move on and change directions. Not necessarily an indictment that Dombrowski's a bad general manager, and I think it was time. I don't know. It's too early to tell if Al Avila is going to be a real improvement, but kind of we the first big moves that we've seen really were the trade deadline deals, kind of bottoming out and getting rid of Cespedes, sending him to the Mets, and the David Price to Toronto deal. And I think that shows kind of a willingness to rebuild and maybe punt this season and kind of retool a bit in the farm system. They got back Michael Fulmer from the Mets in that trade, and he's been, I've covered minor league baseball a bit for Roto World this year. He's been, I would say, easily the best pitcher in the Eastern League and probably all of Double A this year. So that's a big time prospect and a guy that the Tigers really need after losing so many different pieces to this rotation. And I would not be surprised to see him in the Tigers rotation sometime next year. But yeah, I think a lot like the Red Sox, who have the same record as the Tigers and kind of had a good run a few years back, but now are dealing with kind of some bad contracts. I think the Tigers need to take a step back and maybe find some balance. Look to their farm system a little bit more, and like in free agency, don't go for the home run. I think like Cueto and Greinke are going to be free agents this year. Maybe just go with safer guys. They have to shore up the outfield a little bit. There's Denard Span and Gerardo Parra are going to be available. Those are guys that I think they can get for short-term contracts and aren't going to set the team back the way that like a massive $300 million Miguel Cabrera deal, obviously has limited them now. So I guess that's kind of, I don't see any massive like free agent signings. I don't think the Tigers are in a position where they can just be, a contender in a year. I think it's going to take a little time.
And in terms of, you led into my next question, in terms of the trade deadline deals, you touched on it a little bit, but how do you think the trade deadline deals will affect the Tigers in the future? And do you think it was a good idea to get rid of the names like Cespedes, Price, and Soria?
Well, for Price and Cespedes, it was absolutely necessary, just because they really couldn't afford them. They're going to be free agents, and neither player had done anything to really hurt their stock this year. David Price is still young enough where you could get almost a $200 million deal, I would think. And Cespedes is probably he's not going to get $200 million, but he's going to be out of the Tigers' price range, and that's what happens when you sign Miguel Cabrera to a 10-year contract and Verlander to a $200 million contract. That flexibility just isn't there. So whether it will help them on the field or not, I mean, it's not going. They're going to be a worse team without them. Those are two excellent players, and you've seen Cespedes has been red hot for the Mets this past month. But it was just kind of dealing with reality and knowing that we have these bad contracts and we're kind of stuck with them right now, and we're not going to be able to afford these guys. So you might as well get something for them now instead of letting them go for free this winter, which is what happened with Scherzer.
Well, they kind of dropped the ball with that one, but that's okay. And in terms of Justin Verlander, obviously he reassumes the role of the ace of the Tigers staff, and during his last start, of course, he came 3 out short of the third no-hitter of his career. And obviously, if the Tigers are going to get back to where they want to go, they're going to have to get better performances out of him and their entire rotation. So could you give me a thumbnail on the progress of Verlander and just an overall thought on the Tigers' rotation?
Well, obviously Verlander was great last start. I started following it when I saw on Twitter it was blowing up that he was getting close to the no-hitter, something he's done twice before, and he came so close that that double down the line that went just barely was fair. He looked good in that game, and he's at a point in his career where all pitchers go, when they can't throw it 100 miles an hour anymore, and you kind of have to become a paint the corners guy or just use more finesse. He isn't the power guy that he once was, where you can just get away on raw speed. He needs to be a little more cerebral in his approach. And I think it's really interesting to watch that development. Honestly, the win-loss record isn't there for him. He's 2-6, which is just kind of a product of it being a down year for the Tigers and Miguel Cabrera being out for a lot of his starts as well. But the ERA's a big improvement from last year. He's in the mid-3s right about now. And I think he's doing a pretty good job, especially in his last start, really doing a nice job of mixing up his pitches. His velocity is actually a little up from last year, which is good to see. He's at, average fastball is about 93 at this point. So I kind of like where he's headed. He's thrown a lot more sliders this year, fewer changeups. And I think he's never going to be what he once was. But he's a solid, number 2 or 3 guy for you. But yeah, the rest of the rotation, it was such a strength for the Tigers in years past. And, Anibal Sanchez has really been a disaster this year, and I'm not sure what they can do to get him back on track. He's supposed to be kind of a sinker ball pitcher, but it's not sinking. He's given up a lot of home runs. So hopefully it's kind of back to the drawing board with him. But I think the Michael Fulmer trade, getting him for Cespedes was really huge because they need some young arms in the rotation. The guys I just named, Sanchez, I think is 30, and Verlander's in his early 30s. Alfredo Simone's in his mid 30s and has had a bad year. They really need to kind of infuse some youth and kind of start over that way. Shane Green didn't really work out. Buck Farmer has had a really good year in Toledo, and I followed him a bit, covering minor leagues for Roto World, but it just hasn't really translated yet to the major leagues. But I think it might, and he's young enough, and I think he's a guy that they should stick with at the back end of that rotation. So it's very much a work in progress. And there's going to be a point where they're going to have to move on from guys like Sanchez and Simone, who are in their 30s and obviously on the decline. But Fulmer's definitely a guy to be excited about. And I think that as good as Cespedes was, I think they came out ahead in that trade because I mean you don't know if the Mets are going to be able to re-sign Cespedes or not. So I thought that was really wise.
And in terms of the biggest off-season priority, do you think it's restocking the bullpen, what they'll do at left field? What would you assess or categorize as Detroit's biggest off-season priority?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. If they could get kind of a nice cheap to fill out the rotation, maybe. Not that Mike Leake is going to come super cheap, but he won't be as expensive as a guy like Zach Greinke. And I think that would be a realistic starting pitcher they could target. And I think he's had a nice year for Cincinnati and now San Francisco. And there are two decent outfield options that I mentioned earlier. Gerardo Parra, who's had kind of a breakout year between Milwaukee and Baltimore. Doesn't really play defense too well, but he's a solid 300 hitter with a little bit of speed. To have just a little more depth in one of the corner outfield spots would be nice because it's really just been, Ghost, JD Martinez, and Rajai Davis, who I like Rajai Davis. He's really fast. He's a Connecticut guy, which I'm from there. But I don't think on a contending ball club he's an everyday, starting left fielder or right fielder for you. And one guy they could kind of look to from within, if they're going to sit out free agency, which is very possible after all the massive signings and contracts that are already on the books, because there's not a lot of flexibility. Steven Moya, who's been in AAA this year for Toledo, is kind of an interesting guy that might even get a call up when the rosters expand later this month and the AAA season winds down. I think he's going to be an exciting guy for Detroit in the future. He's definitely raw, strikes out a ton, like one of the league leaders probably across all of minor league baseball in striking out. But he's massive. I think he's 6'7", 260, and I think he has legitimate 30 home run, 100 RBI potential. And with such little depth at that position, I think they can afford to bring him up in September and try him out a little bit. It might not go well at first, but let him kind of take his lumps and see if he can play a role next season, maybe.
And what current players on the roster do you think the Tigers have to watch specifically to know what they have going into next year?
There's a lot of them. We touched on Verlander. They are kind of stuck with him, but it'd be nice to know, can he become an ace again after a down year last year, and this year you kind of throw it out the window because he was injured for half of it, which is something that Verlander has really not had to deal with in his career before. So if he can keep throwing the way he did in his last start, where he almost got a no-hitter, and become a number one guy again for them, that would be huge. And maybe you wouldn't have to go out and get a pitcher like Mike Leake or something. I think they just need to kind of figure out who they're building this team around at this point. Miguel Cabrera is here to stay, but these Miguel Cabrera and Verlander are in their 30s. Who's going to still be around? Who's worth signing to a type of extension? And I think two younger guys that you need to kind of look to are Jose Iglesias, a guy I watched a lot. Growing up in the New England area and seeing him play for the Red Sox. Back then, he was always a great defensive player, but couldn't really hit. And now he's become a legitimate 300 guy, which 3 years ago I would have never guessed that. And he's young enough that you can kind of build the team around him. And it's nice with these guys in their major league minimum contracts and arbitration years that you can keep them for cheap. But if you sign Iglesias or maybe even JD Martinez to contract extensions now, you could probably get them cheaper for what they're going to be when they eventually hit the market in a few years. And another guy that I think is going to be interesting to watch his development is Bruce Rondon in the ninth inning. They're giving him a real shot at closer now. And for years, he's kind of been talked up as, the closer of the future just because he has closer stuff. He throws, 100, 101 miles an hour. And that's kind of what you want from your ninth inning guy because, he only has to get 3 outs. But so far, he's really shown very little. I mean, right now, I think his ERA is close to 7. And since the Tigers probably aren't going to make the playoffs, they can afford to keep throwing him out there to the fire. But it would be really interesting to see. And he's still very young, still 24. He could be the closer of the future. And the fastball velocity is definitely something you want to see from a ninth inning guy. But it'd be nice to see if he could kind of batten down the hatches, get a few saves down the stretch, prove that he's the guy over Alex Wilson, and especially develop a second pitch. See if he can use that slider to get outs instead of the bad habit that we see so many one-dimensional young arms fall into is just trying to bomb it 100 miles an hour on every pitch. It's just a recipe for disaster. So those are guys I would be looking for down the stretch.
And my final question for you is, looking at the state of the Tigers now, how would you assess their overall foundation or what they have to build on or around as a franchise?
I mean, there are pieces that are there. They have Miguel Cabrera, who is a foundation player who has not left his prime yet, and that will always keep you in the hunt when you have a guy like that. Do they need to add other pieces around him and kind of test the waters in the minor league system a little bit and give young guys a chance? I think so, and I think you're going to see that over the final month. I think Fulmer's a guy to keep an eye on. I think Moy is a guy who could see significant at-bats next year in the outfield somewhere. So I think there are pieces. It's not like the Cubs where they seem to guess right on every single prospect and they all become major league all-stars, which you're seeing this year. I don't think it's like that, but I think there are a few guys that could come in and help them in the near future. And it's and kind of an old pitching staff, but JD Martinez and Jose Iglesias are hitters that they've gotten a lot from this year and have kind of exceeded expectations. And as I said before, the Royals and Blue Jays are kind of running away with the American League. But other than that, there's really nobody that the Tigers should feel they're that much worse than. It's kind of up for grabs after the Royals and Blue Jays. So maybe guys like Victor Martinez and Anibal Sanchez who have underachieved this year, maybe they come back, play better next year. Verlander stays healthy, Cabrera stays healthy. I could see them being above 500 and very much being, which is, if you're a 500 team in the American League, you are very much in the wild card race. And I could see that happening next year.
Just one final follow-up for you. Do you think age plays a contributing factor as the Tigers assess exactly what they have to do?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're going to have to kind of redo the whole pitching staff at some point. I don't think Simone's going to be a guy who's going to be there for a lot longer. And Sanchez, 3 or 4 years. I think he's 3 years into his contract. He's probably going to sail off into the sunset when his deal expires too. And those guys will probably be switched out with guys like Fulmer and Buck Farmer. Yeah, I think age is definitely a factor. You don't want to become like the Phillies, who have been just a train wreck the last few years because they were too loyal, and all of their big guys, Utley and Howard and Rollins and Hamels, instead of moving on from them, they kept them, and it really hurt them because these are guys that are making a ton of money, are clearly on the decline, and they're letting guys like Dominic Brown just kind of waste away in the minor leagues and not, because they're blocked by guys. And then you see what happened this year where they had to end up trading everyone to the Dodgers. It's a good thing the Dodgers are around to take everybody's bad contracts off their hands. So I think that's something that the Tigers have to be aware of. You do not want to become that team that holds on to their guys too long and just throws too much money at guys. I just think these long-term contracts really hurt teams. The Angels, even I guess Pujols has had a bit of a turnaround year for the Angels. But that contract, as soon as it happened, that really worried me. I was like, you're really paying for 5 years 5 years of their prime when you invest $240 million or a 10-year deal in a guy like Cano or Cabrera or Pujols. So I think a smarter approach, and it's something you can accomplish by signing mid-level guys like Denard Span and Parra this offseason. Get guys on 2 or 3 4-year deals, and I think it just gives you a little more flexibility, and it's safer that way. Instead of being like, who knows what Miguel Cabrera is going to be 5 years from now. I don't. He's definitely not going to be the perennial 3 triple crown threat that he was at the start of the contract. And I think that the Tigers have probably learned from that and won't sign guys to massive deals unless by some chance they do fall upon another Miguel Cabrera, which is really rare.
Unlikely, yeah. Well, Jesse, we thank you for your time this afternoon and for joining us on the Two Man Advantage podcast.
No, thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be on.